Now. Thank you. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and thank you, Joyce, for being here to do this talk. Yes, I will just pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you, Shelby. I'll share my screen and get started. Okay, so I'm going to start with some context. Once upon a time ago, words began to vanish from the language of children. Wren, acorn, willow, moss, fern, dandelion, bluebell, raven, heron, goldfinch, otter, and kingfisher. I don't know if you've seen the book by Robert Macfarlane called The Lost Words, but he wrote that book after these words were removed from the Oxford English Dictionary for Children and replaced with words like copy and paste, as these were no longer relevant to children, which I find completely shocking. So lost words. And as you probably all know, lost birds, that's one of the many biodiversity crises facing us. So we talk a lot about planting trees because of climate change, but our biodiversity crisis is as crucial as our climate crisis. Biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. And you'll see aerial insectivores and eastern forest birds in particular are declining. Biodiversity, this is again Robert Macfarlane, I like his definition, the wondrous, teeming, calamitously threatened variety and variability of life on Earth, sometimes measured by species richness. Red-winged blackbirds they feel like they're extremely common, but there's even a decline in red-winged blackbirds. So in addition to the birds, there's lost insects, lost spiders, lost bees, lost fireflies. Only 17 to 25% of our indigenous forests remain. Most of them are in wetlands, and that's a map of forest cover in southeastern Ontario. And you'll see, especially the further south you go, how little forest cover there is left. Forests are home to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, including very specialist forest bees, which I just ran across an article on forest bees, and that there's debate about how some of the trees are pollinated, and that there are bees that live high up in the trees. And this green sweat bee being one of the bees that pollinates probably those trees. And the fact that we still don't know that is just tells us how little as humans we know. So over half of the 690 species of concern in Ontario use habitat in southern Ontario forests. That red-headed woodpecker is one of those endangered species that relies on habitat in the forests. And where does this go back to? And there's lots of debate about the origins of where our broken relationship with the natural world goes to. But I think this cartoon captures one of them. And Bruno Latour, who's a philosopher, a science philosopher, says that he calls this plantationocene, a very specific historical way of appropriating the land as if land was not there. He calls it historical desoilization of the earth. And when you think of desoilization, these are 4 yards around the world: Texas, Saudi Arabia, Kingston, and I forget where the 4th one is, but you can see they look pretty identical, other than if you look closely, you can see the tree species. Those cookie cutter trees or foundation plantings are slightly different. So yeah, and these monocultures: no food, no water, no shelter, and danger. This is my front yard when I first started out 30 years ago here in Kingston, and my husband wanted a normal front yard. And what's normal? Normal is grass plantations, and control. And that, it feels to me like that same mine perception that we saw in that cartoon. We have crop plantations. We didn't always, even as settlers, we weren't always this way. And this, I found this an old historical reference to this, where this is a weevil. I don't know how many of you recognize the weevils, but this is a grapevine weevil. And in 1545, villagers in a village in France sought appropriate measures. They wanted to expel these weevils from their grapevines. But the courts actually ruled against them, and they ended up with compromise where the weevils were relocated. So there was a point in history where we had a better relationship with the natural world, and we recognized the value of all the different species. Rewilding is often held up as a solution to these problems, but to me, it's like fencing out. And despite the fact I sometimes call myself a rewilder, I think sometimes it's seen as humans are bad and humans have to be fenced out. This is, on the right, images from the last couple of days about what's happening in BC, especially on Sumas. So the one on the right is Sumas Prairie. You may not be aware that Sumas Prairie was once Sumas Lake, and Chief Dalton Silver says they actually, the First Nations there, I think it was about 10 years ago, they put in a court case about the taking away of their lake. It was seen as a great engineering feat to drain the lake, and now we've seen it fail. But this quote by Jeanette Armstrong, we can impact the land in a negative way, or we can impact the land in a positive way. At this time in our lives, what we elders have said is that unless we openize those people, settlers, is who she's referring to, in their thinking, we're all in danger in the Okanagan. The power is us, that we are our security on the land, and that's what's going to sustain us. So the land, Enrique Salmon is, he's got a book called Nidava, really nice book, but he calls the land as a living entity and is constantly in conversation with those who know how to listen to it. And in my own conversation with my land, I guess I listened to the squirrels, because this is what I ended up with. We ended negotiating. If you remember in the picture from the beginning, I had mostly asphalt driveway with grass and some cookie cutter foundation plantings. And so what does it mean to listen to the land? A more philosophical way of viewing biodiversity. So biodiversity is the one definition you've already had. I like this philosophical way that it represents the knowledge learned by evolving species over millions of years about how to survive through the vastly varying environmental conditions Earth has experienced over millions of years. And us humans have only been here for a little part of those millions of years. So a more spiritual way of viewing biodiversity, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, but this is an Anishinaabe word, all our relations. Richard Wagamis says, I've been considering, and this I guess was one of his last Facebook posts before he died, but he's been considering the phrase, all my relations, for some time. Hugely important. It's our saving grace in the end. It points to the truth that we are all related. We are all connected. We belong to each other. The most important word is all, not just those who look like me, sing like me, dance like me, speak like me, pray like me, or behave like me. All my relations. It means every person, just as it means every blade of grass, rock, mineral, and creature. We live because everything else does. If we were to collectively choose to live that teaching, the energy of that change of consciousness would heal all of us and heal the planet. We do it one person, one heart at a time. We are connected. We are the answer. And the spring peepers, this is something I learned from Maureen Buchanan, who's a co-founder of Little Forest Kingston. And she's also a member of Kingston Indigenous Languages Nest. And the piece of land, one of the 3 pieces of land that we planted little forests on, and we just planted in October, was Highway 15. And Highway 15 is the Kingston Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden, or the Highway 15 Food Sovereignty Garden. And she said the first language she heard on the land wasn't Anishinaabe. It wasn't English. It was the spring peepers. And that made her realize the importance of all the languages, that bringing back all the languages to the land. So vanishing words, vanishing species are the signs of vanishing relationships. And the relationships our children especially have to the land. We have lost connection and our children have lost connection. So the question isn't how do we reforest or how do we plant enough trees to save climate, but how do we restore relationships? That's the question I think is really important with little forests. And you've all heard of some of the big high-tech schemes that will rescue us and planting all these trees. But over 50% of them end up in tree plantations and there's no relationship there. So this is from Joanne Whitfield, again, someone else there's three of us that we really co-founded Little Forest Kingston, and she's teacher librarian at Kingston Secondary School. And she says what makes it Little Forest Kingston different is infusing Indigenous ways of knowing. And we see it as an embodiment of the land acknowledgement. So we can speak about land acknowledgement, but are we actually doing something? And so for us, it's like coming into relationship with the land. Humans are a keystone species. So you've heard salmon is a keystone species with rewilding, bringing back, in the UK, they're bringing back beavers as a keystone species, bringing back wolves as a keystone species, and humans are also a keystone species. And this is on the right-hand side, you see that Maya-Milpa cycle. And it was a method of agriculture that I think it was Charles Seaman said is one of the greatest technological inventions in human history. And it's a method of agriculture that was slash and burn, plant annual crops, then plant perennial crops and trees. And over 50 plus years, you end up with a mature forest that is then left behind. The mature forest is different than the forest that it began with. It had more nut and fruit bearing. But it was a deeply relational way of being on the land. And so humans can be very positive. Robin Wall Kimmerer says, if you came into a world where you saw those pines were people, teachers, ones who were giving you medicine, who were caring for you, would you come in and claim every damn one of them for the King of England? Would you devastate the landscape? In our way of thinking, it was genocide of pines. And there's trauma and suffering associated with that. But if you don't think of them as kin, if you don't think of them as people, if you only think of them as property and natural resources, then you're morally blameless. There's no guilt. So itting the world does create a moral distance. It enables and gives permission for exploitation because it's just stuff. But there is this other way of putting your hands in the earth and getting to work and saying, yeah, we made a lot of mistakes, but we can be healers too. And that's one of the kids that helped us in planting the little forests. We had kids out pretty much every day, and the schools came out, best field trip ever. So how might we welcome all the languages of the more than human world back to the land? And so this is the Miyawaki inspired approach that we're taking to planting little forests here in Kingston. So Miyawaki, Dr. Akira Miyawaki, and you're maybe all familiar with him, but his question he asked was, we don't have 150 to 200 years for natural succession or current theory of natural succession to work to bring back these extremely biodiverse forests. And if you left the land alone, a land that had been forested, which our area had been. So he asked, how can you squeeze that into 15 to 20 years? And after the tsunami in Japan, he got particularly interested in protecting the coastlines. And so he's been planting these Miyawaki forests along the coastlines as well. And he's also looking at it as a forest across a landscape. And this again, they're looking at in Japan, planting these little forests along waterways, around buildings as ways of slowing water and protecting infrastructure. This is his theory of succession. On the left is that 150 to 200 year, where you start with the annual herb community weeds as we often see them. And the right-hand side is the Miyawaki method, where you plant the range of species for a forest. And in 20 to 30 years, end up with the biodiversity of that 150-year-old forest. So he inspired Shubhendu Sharma, who was an engineer at a factory that Miyawaki was planting a forest in India. And then Shubhendu Sharma gave TED Talks and inspired people around the world, including in Netherlands, who've so far planted over 100, and they call them tiny forests, which they've trademarked, because there they are, to be a tiny forest, to use that trademark, you have to be associated with the school and follow their exact methodology, which we're not doing here in Kingston, so we're calling them little forests. And you've probably seen it, just even since I did that, they've been here in Pakistan, they're looking at it as a countrywide strategy. In India, Shumini Sharma isn't the only group that they're doing across India. You've probably seen Europe, France, and just all over the place. They're looking at planting these style of little tiny Miyawaki-inspired forests. But you think about them as we're not planting trees, we're designing with plant communities that will evolve with competition and succession. And this is also really what regenerative planting design is. So the newer plant community approach to planting design, it's a similar, where it's not about the individual plant. And Noel Kingsbury is part of that new planting approach to, what we might call gardening, that it's not about the survival of any individual plant, but the survival of the whole. So when we're planting little forests, that's what we're thinking about. It's like the succession and the success of the forest. And some trees will live, not all trees will live, but we will end up with a forest community. And I always think about co-design, but ever since doing a spring presentation on the seed dispersal or doing spring wildflower, especially forest seeds of our spring ephemerals, ants are they're a keystone species in the forest that so few of us know anything about. They're like the earthworms of the forest that prepare the soil, and they plant like over 35% of the species. So we co-design with all the different species. And I love Anna Singh's definition of sustainability, where she says meaningful sustainability requires multi-species resurgence. That is the remaking of livable landscapes through the actions of many organisms. So a landscape, Kenneth Old would say, I would say a little forest is the type of landscape, is a multi-species gathering in the making. And this was a group of high school kids who came out to plant. And the fellow there with a shovel, he's a grade 11 student. And this was on Highway 15, which is the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden. And so it began with a circle around a sacred fire, and the kids received a teaching on trees, and then they came and learned how to plant the trees for the little forest. And then a couple of hours later, the grade 9 students, and you see some of them on the right there, they came and they received the teaching, and then they came over, and it was the grade 11 students who taught the grade 9 students. And this young man here, he was an absolutely fabulous teacher. You sat there listening to him thinking, oh boy, he's going to be a future, I don't know, educator. And Robin Wall Kimmer says, imagine a different relationship in which people and land are good medicine for each other. And for me, that's what I saw happening on the land as we were planting these forests. So for a new normal, a little forest, all you need is an area the size of 6 parking spaces or 100 square meters. Now, if I was doing my front yard now, that's what I could have done, is done in little forest methodology. Instead, it was the squirrels who planted it for me. There's another method of forestation called the framework species method. And I thought it was interesting that as they list through the stages, because I've been, some people have said, oh, well, can't you just let the land be and it will reforest itself, which we know in 150 years it will. And creatures and jays and squirrels will bring in if there's other trees nearby. But in this stage 4, if there's no remaining trees and seed sources, then same as stage 3, where you're doing the planting, you have to do it much higher density, such as the Miyawaki method. So the framework species method itself, when there's not nearby plants, you're doing that same method. They recommend it. So this is the kind of process that we've gone through in planting our little forests, and I'll go through each step. but choose a kinship group, suited to the land is the first one, except that I realized that really that's not the first one. The first step is actually forming a community. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, again, restoring land without restoring relationships is an empty exercise. It is relationship that will endure and relationship that will sustain the land. We're getting more interest here around little forests, but our first question is always, who is the community that is going to form around the little forest to care for it? We can't plant them and forget about them. And with Little Forest Kingston, this was the posters that Maureen had put together for the Little Forest to try and bring the Indigenous community around, the urban Indigenous community around the Little Forest for Highway 15. And Lakeside Community Garden, I had included it in our 3-phase plan, and Kingston has an edible orchard policy, and we snuck it in under phase 3 of the edible orchard policy by calling it edible tiny nut forest. And the city was a little freaked out by 3 things per square meter, but they ended up giving us permission, so we were able to do it. So these were the 4 that we had planned: the Lakeside Community Garden, which is a community garden community; Wolf Island, which is Wolf Island has a very strong island community, and they pulled that together to plant theirs near community center. Champlain Park was to be our first school community. We didn't end up getting permission from the city because, again, that's in a city park, and they seem to have forgotten all about the Lakeside one because that permission was given a few years ago. And so that one is still being negotiated. We're hoping to plant that one in 2021. And then Highway 15 is an urban Indigenous community site. For 2022, the one that so far we've got confirmed, and there was actually a 4th floor preparation day today, is Addictions and Mental Health Services on Lion Street. And there's a 300 square meter little forest going in there, along with a food forest and some raised beds. The other thing we're looking at, and Ottawa, I think, did this past summer, was a heat map. They measured on some of the hottest days the heat distribution in different neighborhoods and looked against socioeconomic status. But we're going to be looking at that in Kingston in this summer. We're working with a group of PhD students on this project, and we're hoping to have high school students then map their neighborhoods over the summer and identify areas that are really lacking canopy cover, and seeing if the students can actually find and bring together a community to plant a little forest in those areas. The second step, which had been the first step, was learning the history of the land and the local forests. And if you've a gardener at all, you've seen this chart about our planting zones. But when we're working with plant communities and when we're working with little forests, we need to think beyond these planting zones. So I think Ottawa, where you 5A, 5B, we're 6 now in Kingston, but really that's irrelevant. What's relevant is mixedwood plains. We're in the mixedwood plains ecozones, and that knowing that it's home to greatest diversity of plants, trees and plants than any other part of Canada. So getting to know the ecozones and ecoregions of southern, southeastern, central Ontario. So Lake Simcoe Rideau ecoregion 6E is where we are. And then once you know that, looking at the forest types, let's see the upland tolerant hardwoods and the dominant species and uncommon associate species. So getting to know like the silviculture manuals. And so this is not at all the type of gardening literature I was used to reading. The last year, I've been doing intensive deep dives into learning about forests in southern, southeastern Ontario. I still have a lot of learning to do. There's really not books in this area. This is more, we have in general so much learning to do. And this is another really useful chart that comes from Forest Management Guide to Silviculture. That's really helpful in that it understanding the fertility of the soil along with the soil moisture. In our sites, we had a lowland, very wet site, and then we had upland dry sites. And so the forest communities that we're planting differ across the sites. And one of the things I wish is, see this chart on the right, that would be fir, and you'll see how fir is overlaid to see what type of conditions it likes here. Not all trees in this guide, though, are mapped this way, but that's a very helpful, the ones that are, it's very helpful for understanding, will they live well in most forests, or are they more associated? The other thing I think is interesting, and I think this is more of a future learning, I think we have so much learning to do on this, is this temperature and moisture in relation to aspects you'll see, like the elevation changes and the streams and the ponds, and that each of these have microsites microclimates in each of these. And a forester that we talked to said, oh, you could like do a furrow and plant different species on the higher part of the furrow versus the lower part of the furrow. We did not get to that level of sophistication, but it's something interesting to think about. And this is something that Stefan Weber did on 16 Mile Creek in Oakville. And you'll see in this hanging elevation, the upland forest edge and the species that differ there from the bluff slope forest versus the lowland forest. So the elevations are one of the important things to think about when choosing species. So this, we're in the eastern ecoregion, and you can see here, we're down in Prince Edward County. You'd be up in the Ottawa Carleton section, and this is on the Forest Gene Conservation Association website. So if you haven't been there, that's really worth going to. I ran across this set of questions just yesterday, and I really quite like it. And this is asking about the land. Where is here? Who am I that I am here? Who else is alongside me? What gives and sustains life here? How can I participate in the life that is here? How can we live well together here? I think this is a wonderful set of questions that we can be asking ourselves about the space or the land that we're on. And this is the Highway 15 site, which looks nothing like this today. This was in early spring, and today you would not recognize it. So this is where, I mean, this was a pasture and been mowing for hay for a number of years now. And this is really what this land would want to be when they stop mowing. With Miyawaki, and again, the Forest Gene Conservation Association, their list of species for Ecodistrict 6E-15 Picton, this was one of our sources to help us choose our species. There's 4 layers in a Miyawaki forest, and we kind of sat there, okay, what are the canopy according to the Miyawaki method? And those are the black basswood, black walnut, white oak, white pine, and then our tree layer, understory layer, and shrub layers. So that's not the full list, but it just gives you an idea. We have a spreadsheet, so if you've been on the Little Forests page on the Master Gardener site, you can download and kind of grab the spreadsheet. We're working with 4th year computer science students and hoping to turn this actually into a database to make it much easier to work with. But again, I'd say we learned some lessons and we wouldn't do it quite this way again. The top 5 species here, though, 5 species in the Miyawaki method are your major forest species, which should form 40 to 50% of the total number in your forest. And if you remember back to that, that chart of forests where it says, what are your dominant species in the hardwood forest? Those 5 species would really be the species that would listed as dominant in a certain type of forest. Restoring relationships, to me, also means helping trees migrate. We are unquestionably in a climate crisis. Trees, they know, can't migrate fast enough. Climate has changed too fast. And then in addition to not being able to migrate fast enough, there's Toronto and highways in the way, so they need our help. Environment and Energy Ontario says that if current climate conditions in this ecoregion 7E, Carolinian, move as predicted, the plants and animals there will have to adapt, move, or die. And so in Kingston, we're migrating the little forest, especially the lakeside forest is has Carolinian species. We're doing climate migration with those. Lake Simcoe did this analysis of climate change, and they put down a list of retreating species that they thought would be not so successful in the future in the Lake Simcoe area that are there now, species that should endure no matter how the climate changes, and species that will be moving into the area. And you'll see at the bottom those Carolinian species. Ottawa, I'm not sure about, does Carolinian species migrate as far as there? I think some of these would succeed in your area. Kingston we weren't Carolinian before, but we had Carolinian species. And so what we see is that there will be more, and there will be more seed sources coming from the Carolinian. And so this is the South Carolinian area that, the species will be migrating from. The other thing that is playing in our minds, and we've talked about it, but we haven't really, I think we'll be talking a lot more about it, and we might have a study group around agroforestry. And this is from Lila June in an article, Forest is Farm, where she looks at core samples. I was looking at core samples in Kentucky, but where a forest, just like I mentioned in the Maya-Milpa cycle, the forest evolved over years from, in this case, cedar and hemlock, into a forest that had many edible species. The pollen samples changed, and the thinking is that it was humans, it was the people who evolved that forest over time, planting those species. And even there's trees that you'll hear, oh, they grow well by rivers, but they're not really wetland species. And is it the reason that they're along the rivers is because that they were planted. The seeds were brought along, the nuts especially were brought along and planted. Kentucky coffee tree is one of those. Second part is restoring the soil biodiversity, and Maureen actually has called it decolonizing the soil. The soil has been so devastated by colonization. So Lakeside, these are two of our soil samples. Lakeside is like 98% clay. If you measured at those layers, there's teeny tiny bit of sand layer there. Highway 15 we thought was pretty heavy clay, but it turns out it's clay, silt, and sand. So it's a much more balanced mix than Lakeside. Our forest floor prep, ideally we do a year in advance, and the addictions and mental health forest floor is going in now, and the planting will be next fall. Fall is when we're doing our plantings, just because the trees settle in best in the fall, and we don't have to worry. This year we had a very long spring drought, and we would have had to be doing a lot of watering. And then with the Lakeside clay, planting in spring in that super heavy clay is horrendous, and it can really hurt the survival of the plants because the clay really doesn't separate out. So our forest floor prep is 10 to 15 centimeters of leaves or straw or that type of organic matter, followed by 2 to 3 centimeters of compost or manure that's been well aged, and then 10 to 15 centimeters of arborist wood chips. So this is Lakeside's soil, the final bit of soil prep, and Sweetgrass Circle, and that's Joanne on the right there. Sweetgrass Circle is a club at the high school that is working to understand, I guess, Indigenous worldviews. And here they created a soil ceremony, and Priya, who's not in the picture, she actually created a song which she sang at the beginning of the planting at Lakeside for the soil. This is a bucket of forest soil we collect at, Maureen and Joanne went out to different forests and collected forest soil from different forests. And that was to bring it and to offer it. And so as we planted each tree, we had people invited them to take a handful of forest soil and add it to the hole with the trees as a gift to the trees, bring in the biodiversity of the soil microorganisms from a healthy forest. Sourcing indigenous seedlings from diversity of parents and regional genetics. So that's the next part. And on this picture of red oaks, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 were from different areas, and they were all planted at exactly the same time in the same greenhouse in the same conditions. And the one on the left is a Niagara red oak, and the one on the right is an Algonquin Park red oak. And if you took that Niagara or the Niagara red oak and planted it in Algonquin Park, you may end up with, well, you see the spruce seedlings where they have a 7-day longer growing season. There's a lot of damage. There's been very little research though, so they don't know how many trees have this, will suffer in a very, if you plant them well outside of the eco district they're from. And it's something that we think about. And biodiversity crisis. So this is a beautiful butternut on Wolf Island. And as we plant, and growing from seed is so important because the biodiversity within the species is equally important and equally at risk. And the only reason this butternut may live on and become a parent for the butternut canker resistant butternuts in the future, because that's only possible if we have as many butternuts. And the same with the ash right now are at risk because of ash borer. And we cut down so many of the ashes rather than leaving some of them to see are some resistant, and can they become parents resistant. So the diversity within species. And then you'll see on the right, the genetic diversity, different plants also have different medicinal qualities depending on the soil and their genetics. So again, the little we know and maximizing the biodiversity because the plants know so much more. This is just even bloodroot, and look at the flowers on the bloodroot, how different they are. And these are all just from the genetic diversity. And so having a limited stock when we're planting versus the seed stock from as wide as possible is important. This is also, I think, interesting in that when I did a seed workshop with Forest Ontario about 5 years ago. It was a 1-day workshop. And at the time they were collecting seed from, so this like 6E-1 is a very specific seed zone. And then they migrate up to 6E-2. They would migrate up for climate. At that time, they were doing up one seed zone. But this one is from, I think my thing is covered, but at the bottom there, Ontario Seed Transfer Policy now would take seeds from this whole area in red and migrate any of those seeds up to seed zone 6E6. So that's now their seed transfer policy in terms of, I guess, for climate migration. And John Pedler, who is a National Research Council forest landscape biologist, used to be very against climate migration. And now he's like, climate change is everything, and no longer saying that we need to stay within our seed zones because of the climate crisis. We did the bulk of our order from Verbinen's nursery, and they propagate from seed from a range of seed sources in more towards this area. So I think it was a good match. And because they're from, and this is just a quote from their website, giving you the genetic diversity necessary for naturally resilient trees, shrubs, and perennials. So is looking for a source where they're growing from seed with a genetically diverse stock from seed zones that would be appropriate for your area. Then fostering cooperation and competition. And the estimate is that within the Owaki forest, within the first few years, you should have like a 2 to 5%, like no more rate of loss. And then you're going to get very rapid growth. And that's partly because of that mycorrhizal network. We've forgotten, and Suzanne Simard has really brought this to our attention, that these are complex ecosystem. A tree is not a standalone being sitting in a pile of dirt. It's in soil with a billions of microorganisms and fungi that are connecting them together with each other. And also humans, we're holobionts, a word that I learned this year, where we ourselves are complex ecosystems, and they now have this hypothesis called the urban microbiome rewilding hypothesis, which is our guts, our microbiomes are healthier the more vegetation there is. So as we reforest or bring more green into our urban areas, we ourselves will be healthier as our own our own biodiversity increases. So A-Forest takes an engineered approach to their planting. You'll see them divide it into squares, so those are their 1 meter grids. And they carefully design out like no more than 1 canopy tree and having different layers in each grid. Miyawaki, on the other hand, he's much more random. He likes to plant with children, and because he says that's the way nature does it. And he's okay that there might be more loss as a result with it, because again, he says that's how nature does it. When the squirrels plant, they don't go sit there and say, oh, it can be no more than 30 centimeters apart. And I would say we kind of did a bit of each. The sweetgrass circle, we had a few things that arrived in the spring, a few plants. We did persimmons was one of them, some red mulberries, so a few Carolinian species, and they plant it. And I told them the different methods and asked which ones they'd like to do, and they went for the random. And so they wandered around and found spots that they just felt called to them for planting those species. Robin Wall Kimmerer says trees act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. Exactly how, we don't know, but this is the power of unity. And you'll see, this is one of the science articles on some of the thinking about why a community does better, but shading and canopy packing, the differential in water spatial resources, timing and water uses, diverse microbial community. And so there's a whole bunch of theories, reduced accessibility to herbivores, pathogens, a number of different things that they're starting to think about why the biodiverse forests, where it used to be told, oh no, the competition is you've got to space trees 30 meters apart because of the competition. Well, no. And I found this very recently too. The trunk on the right, the 11-year-old trunk you'll see on this left here, the sides of that trunk versus the 11-year-old trunk on the right-hand side of the screen. Those are, the one on the left is from a monoculture forest. The one on the right is from a biodiverse forest. And the trees grow bigger trunks faster in a biodiverse forest, the trees of the same species. So that would be the same species of a tree. We planted in community, and this was just one of the things in the Highway 15 planting. Someone came and played their cello to the forest, and here's Clark playing his guitar with a little bit of a sing-along near the end of the planting day at Lakeside. Our poet laureate came and he wrote a poem called Tree in the morning, and he came and read it quietly to a tree. He didn't read it to us, he read it to the tree in the afternoon. Then there's caring for and restoring relationship with our Indigenous forests. So centering the land is our teacher, and this is Maureen Buchanan, one of the people, one of the co-founders of Little Forest Kingston. And this is a patch on Bell Island, which has a long Indigenous history. It's important to the Indigenous community here in Kingston. And this is a patch that was flattened when some people who were houseless were camped on the island this last summer. And so she was using this as an opportunity with, because one of the things we're thinking about is watching for invasive species. And so how does the community caring for the forest learn about and monitor for invasive species? And so she decided to use this patch of land as an experiment for that. And so we wandered the forest and found some species, brought them here and transplanted them, and have captured like which are the invasive species and how do we watch. But here's a series of questions, and Maureen created a new word in Anishinaabe for invasive species, which actually doesn't have the word invasive in it. And I don't remember the word, but it's something like someone who's not known to us. And I love the series of questions. And I think this is a series of questions that we'll want to be using as we monitor and observe the little forests as they grow. And somebody comes in, a plant that comes in that we're not familiar with, asking the questions, what is this being telling me? What are ways I can listen? Who are you? Why are you here? What have you brought us? Let's get to know you and what you're bringing. What do you need? What are your relationships? Who is your family? How do you fit in? And we're going to really make the little forest a center for on the land learning. We planned this with Lakeside before COVID hit, and this was the forest series that we were looking at doing. We're going to do it again next year, and the schools all came out to plant, and they're really, really interested in doing ongoing learning on the land. And so we're going to be working on what that looks like. Then deepening our relationship with the diversity of species as they return to the land. Oh, and I didn't say we will be watering. We have to water them for the first 2 to 3 years too. So we got a watering system for each one. Here, these are the kids on Wolf Island. They actually made, someone made a video afterwards, but the kids on their own, they weren't prompted to do this. They started naming the trees that they were planting. So Astrid, who was the coordinator for that site, she originally had this number of trees that she thought each kid would plant. In the end, they only planted one each because they got so into naming their the tree that they were planting. So Tiny Piney, Mint, Stanley, these are some of the names. And then they took pictures with their tree and measured themselves against the tree with plans to come back. So learning how little forests develop, monitoring biodiversity, and measuring climate benefits. Those are things that we're looking at doing over time over the next few years. Richard Powers from In Over Story says there are no individuals in a forest, no separable events. The bird and the branch, it sits on a joined thing. A third or more of the food a big tree makes may go to feed other organisms. Even different kinds of trees form partnerships. And that's a saddleback caterpillar covered with brachynoid wasp cocoons. So the caterpillar needs the oak leaves and the wasp needs the caterpillar, and then the birds need the wasp. But these are the things that we can be learning as these forests start to grow and mature, and that the kids may discover and find and learn. What might we learn in conversation with sweat bee, firefly, ant, spring peeper, oak, striped maple, slippery elm, pawpaw? This is just a stump in my yard. I love stumps, and we are adding stumps and old wood to the little forests to help with that transition of the soil and the land towards a more forest soil. And you'll see the stump is probably 2-3 years old here, and how almost I think of the mushrooms that appear on it as flowers. And here, last year was really exciting because here's those little green sweat bees, which I guess are big forest pollinators. They moved in, overwintered in the stump. These are some of the kids from Kingston Secondary School Sweetgrass Circle, and their reflections on what it meant for them to be involved in little forests. And most of them had moved away before and went to university before planting this fall. Robert, the one on the right, his mother came out to plant and kept sending, and because he was in, I forget where he is, I think he's in Toronto. And so she came out and planted and kept sending him pictures throughout the day. And then in the future, are they multi-species refugia? This article in The Guardian talked about, they studied two woodlands in the UK over a 30-year period where more than half the trees were planted by jays. So they rewilded, they did natural succession, more the typical way, the slower way that Miyawaki talks about as a passive rewilding. So if there are seeds in the vicinity, and here the thrushes spread seeds of bramble, and the brambles protected the acorns and the other nuts that jays planted. So these forests became more, just like my yard, more nut heavy because of who was close by and the seed sources close by. But little forests, to me, that's what they become. They become seed sources for future forests that may be seeded by like robins eating the service berries or the squirrels spreading the acorns and the other nuts. And by little children. This is one of the things that we want to do, and we did in the one planting at Lakeside. The one school group, we split them into 3 stations, and one of the stations we had the kids planting tree seeds. And so this is one of the ways we hope to be starting our own seeds and mini nursery for future little forests. So now's the time we need to be doing this, growing awareness of biodiversity, of the need for relationships, growing the community around planting the little forests and growing the little forests themselves. And the right-hand side is, if you drive down on Front Road or Highway 15, you'll see all these little flapping flags, and these are marking the trees that we planted. So for 6 parking spaces, that's all we need. And this is Maureen planting the last of our 1,800 seedlings with the last school group that came out. And here's what she said at the end of the day: Chi miigwech apchigo, to all the people who put their loving intentions in this Emma and planted the baby oldest elders. A huge big thanks. It's quite an accomplishment. And there's a Navajo blessing way, and David Abraham, I found it in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous. And as part of this blessing way, and this is, I think, something when I say biodiversity, the spiritual side of biodiversity, that in the blessing way, they never forget the importance of all these different beings. This is an old oak, maybe 350 years old on Wolf Island that we found, just met 2-3 weeks ago. But the blessing way says, with everything having life, with everything having the power of speech, with everything having the power to breathe, with everything having the power to teach and guide, with that in blessing we will live. So that is it, little forests. I will stop sharing. I can find my thing. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you, Joyce. That was so interesting. I definitely learned a lot. And I think it's awesome how you guys get youth involved as well. That's something that's come up a lot. So I guess we can take any questions for Joyce if anyone has any. Yep, Steve.
Hey, Stephen.
Thank you, Joyce. That was absolutely beautiful. Like, it was informative, but it was also a beautiful presentation. I hope you do it many times because it needs a wider audience. So I'm very interested in what you've learned about companion species, and I learned a lot here, but I feel it was like watching a performance that went by and now I can't go back for reference. I'll
try and share that. If I clean up my slides and make sure everything's referenced properly, I can end up sharing it. Maybe I'll put it in SlideShare or something so that you can access it. It might take me like a couple of weeks to do that, but I will try and do that so that that you can go back and look.
Well, that would be greatly appreciated. You mentioned that you're building a database. Is that something that will be on the internet? Can you tell more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a 4th year computer science project where we're meeting weekly with them, and it's due, they have to deliver end of March. And so right now they're in the back end design phase. I have no idea what to expect in terms of, we did all these requirements around it and we're working with them with a 4th year computer science project. I don't know if I should have high expectations or not. So we really won't know until we get further along in the project. But the hope would be that right now we've got the spreadsheet, which I think most people find, even though the landscape people who've used it say, oh, this is fabulous, this is really great. For any of us who aren't spreadsheet users, who haven't done it any other way, it's like really painful to work with, especially if you have to make changes. So, I hope that the database is something that everyone can use, but won't know for until March.
I'm going to have to sign off because I have a Foray Capital Forest event meeting to go to in 2 minutes. But thank you so much, Joyce. That was just wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming, Stephen.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, are there any
Hey,
other
Heather.
questions? Oh, sorry.
I think Heather has a question. Yeah,
Oh, you're on mute.
you're muted.
I'm wondering about temperature of streams, because I know here I've had plants killed by wild temperature swings. And so that's another factor that's going to make it very difficult for plants to move. I love some of the Carolinian forest plants, and we've actually got a tiny forest going in our community of Champlain Park. And but given the experience I've had, where sometimes I lose plants that are supposed to be for zone 5A, which is what we are supposed to be, I've started just planting things that are for zone 4, and I seem to be having a little more luck in my yard. So just wondering if that's something that anybody has thought about, or if you've got any advice.
I mean, that partly goes towards microclimate too. So again, like the zone 4, 5, 6, moving away from that type of thinking towards the microclimate that you're in. And then a forest moderates itself, so they can, the species, if they're planted together, can withstand temperature extremes much better than species on their own. And then there's also like birch. One of the reasons that the Lake Simcoe thing is thinking birch will be retreating from, and that would be the Kingston area too, I'm not sure about Ottawa, is because while birch can withstand extreme cold, it doesn't tolerate the fluctuations. And so you can have a zone, I don't know, like I've had. So the zone, it can withstand the cold, but if it can't, like if you get like that warm spell and it thinks spring is coming, and then it gets really cold again. So the zone 4, 5, 6, it is not as meaningful as can it withstand the fluctuations, what types of fluctuations are happening, and is in a community, what type of microclimate it's in.
Yeah, for us, I think it's the fluctuations that are really bad. We're along the Ottawa
Yeah.
River, where you would expect maybe a little more moderation because that river is quite wide, but we still end up, at least where I am, on the limestone bedrock, end up with a lot of plants dying, trees dying, because they can't handle the temperature swings. I have had great luck with stuff that the squirrels plant, though. Squirrels planted in grooves. So whatever the squirrels plant, if it's in a good spot, I leave it.
Yeah, and then things planted often from seed can be much more resilient, which is why I like the Miyawaki method with the very young trees being planted.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, like, depending on the depth of your soil, I was
There's
doing research. Sorry?
There's no depth of soil here. I have built
Yeah.
it up over a number of years by guarding all my leaves and my neighbor's leaves and mulching like mad.
Yeah. And so that, I mean, that's also watching which species, because some species do much better on shallow soils. I was doing research around elvars and shallow, limestone soils. And there are species that will, forest communities that will do well on them. And then others that, you'll just end up with much shorter lived species. So that's something else to really think about, is look at elvar forest communities to see species that might do better, like shagbark hickories of all things.
This used to be great for elms, chestnuts, and of course they're all gone, and we're left with the oaks. And
Right.
the bur oaks are, of course, wonderful until something comes along to destroy them.
No, hopefully not.
Yeah.
I think Rochelle also had a question.
Yeah, it's not, well, it may be a question, but it's also a remark. Joyce, I really appreciated my visit to your Miyawaki forest. I thank you so much for all the explanations that you gave me. And it's truly remarkable when you see the work that they've done. I think some of the photos doesn't give justice to your Miyawaki forest because of all the little flags that I saw when I was visiting. It's quite impressive to see what you've done. We're certainly going to follow that same approach when we develop our Miyawaki forest here in Orleans. And the one question I had for you though, I think I may have asked that when I visited you. When you have your list of your inventory of trees, I know your website has a lot of resource information that we can use, all the different trees, you know, how they if they're canopy trees, if they're just trees, you know, like it's quite impressive what you've developed. When we look at the different compatible trees, like a Miyawaki is 3 trees per square meter. So is there a list on your inventory that would show us which ones are better with another or which ones are more compatible?
No, and that would be one of the things that I don't even know if we know the answers to. In that, I think that's a really tough one, and this is where I'm with him with the planting with kids. Is like the kids plant, you plant randomly, and then you learn over time. So as we see over the next 5 to 10 years, and I think as all of us plant little forests and watch and learn, I think that's where our learning will come. And the other thing I would say is just with you know, those forest communities, and I'm debating, is there a way in the database to show some of it? But in those forest communities, it says like the dominant species and then the species that are commonly found with those dominant species. And I don't know if the spreadsheet right now does that very well and highlights that. And I had read that one of the mistakes that Miyawaki said that Shimada Sharma made, and so Sharma took down, he originally had some open source information up on his website and he took it down because he was critiqued by Miyawaki, was that, that, for example, a rare species should be rare in your planting as well, which I would say we did not do in our little forest because we really want pawpaws. So we have more, and red mulberries too, because lakeside we were focusing as well as on edible. So I think we may end up over long term, maybe with not as many of them, you know, surviving. But then maybe that's okay, because then we think back to agroforestry, and I mentioned the agroforestry example where forests were changed over time. I don't know. What is an indigenous forest? Is there an exact model? What role do humans have in the species that are there? What role have humans had over the centuries that they have been in North America? So I think there's a lot of really open questions. But one thing that I was thinking about is we don't have our protection up yet. And we need to get it up soon, like the little white, we're going to put those little white spiral wraps, and the flags are partly there to hold up the spirals. So when you put down the spirals, the shagbark hickories are so short that there's no way a spiral can protect them. And outside of the little forest, we planted at Highway 15 some shellbark hickories, and the rabbits came and nipped them all down really quickly. And Astrid has said, oh, don't put up the spiral wraps, and they're not even here yet until it freezes, because the voles can move in and make their houses in there. And so far we haven't seen the rabbits actually go into the little forests, just in the trees that were separated from the forest. But the example from England about the, the forest planted by the squirrels and the birds makes me think those thorny species, and we do have some of the thorny shrub layer, that maybe having more thorny shrub layer might be helpful for the protection of those little trees. So I don't know. I think we have a lot to learn.
Thank you.
Did anyone
You moved on
else?
my screen, so I was looking in the top left corner thinking, you're not there anymore, Michelle. It's funny how Zoom does that sometimes.
Did anyone else have any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So thank you again, Joyce. That was very inspirational. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. Yeah, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Joyce. Have a good night.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Joyce.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.